In the autumn of 1944, as the Allied armies pushed steadily eastward, following their breakout from Normandy, the war on the Western Front entered a new and brutally unstable phase. American troops advancing into France found themselves confronting terrain and weather far harsher than anything they had faced during the summer. The Vosges Mountains, stretching across the Franco-German frontier, became a crucible where entire units struggled to advance through thick forests, razor-sharp ridgelines, mud-choked valleys, and sudden fog that could swallow a battalion whole. It was in this environment, months before the world-famous chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, that one of the least celebrated but most astonishing acts of individual courage in American military history unfolded. The man at the center of it did not fit Hollywood's idea of a warrior. He was not a towering figure with a fearsome reputation. He was not a rifleman groomed from youth to be a soldier. Instead, he was a 33-year-old Tennessee man with quiet features, a calm temperament, and a job title that suggested anything but heroics on the battlefield: company cook. Charles Henry Coolidge had grown up in the rural American South during the Depression, working odd jobs and learning to survive with very little. Before the war, he was not a man of great public ambition, nor did he have political aspirations, academic accolades, or a reputation as a brawler. He simply possessed the hardiness of a man who had worked outdoors, who knew the weight of labor, and who understood the quiet dignity of doing one's duty without seeking recognition. When drafted into the U.S. Army, Coolidge was assigned to Company M of the 36th Infantry Regiment, part of the 7th Infantry Division. Because of his age, his demeanor, and his reliability, he was often given logistical or support tasks rather than frontline assault duties. Eventually, he became the company's cook, a position that meant long hours, heavy lifting, and looking after the needs of hungry soldiers returning exhausted from patrols or firefights. What it did not mean, at least on paper, was direct combat. But the war did not care who someone was on paper. In October 1944, the American advance into the Vosges Mountains met stiff and unexpected resistance. The German army, particularly units associated with the 11th Panzer Division, had pulled back into the rugged highlands and established defensive networks designed to slow or halt American momentum. Infantry, engineers, machine gun detachments, and armored elements worked together to fashion a lethal combination of ambushes and counterattacks. These forces were experienced, disciplined, and supported by terrain ideally suited for defense. American units found themselves marching into forests where visibility dropped to almost nothing, where sound bounced strangely off trees and rock walls, and where the narrow trails could be mined, trapped, or covered by hidden enemy machine guns. It was in this zone, near the small French village of Beazelsberg, that Coolidge's company moved forward on what was supposed to be routine reconnaissance and positioning, nothing that suggested the extraordinary events about to unfold. As Company M pushed toward the wooded high ridge they were assigned to hold, they quickly realized they were not alone. German patrols shadowed their movements. Intermittent shots cracked in the distance. The terrain became tighter, the air colder. Reports filtered in of significant enemy troop movements to the east. Though no one could say precisely how many enemy soldiers were present or what their intentions were, line companies needed time to establish a proper defensive perimeter, to set up heavy weapons, and to assess the ground. Coolidge, who had joined the movement forward to support the men and help manage supplies, was not expected to be in the center of any major action. Yet fate had other plans. What began as a somewhat tense advance turned with startling speed into a crisis. On October 24, 1944, Company M encountered a large and determined German force that immediately launched attacks designed to overwhelm the American position. At first, the scale of the threat was unclear. Fire erupted from multiple directions. German voices echoed through the trees, and shells burst against the rocky ground. The company's machine gun team was hit almost immediately, leaving their Browning .30 caliber weapon unmanned. This machine gun was the linchpin of the company's defensive capability. Without it, the men were little more than scattered riflemen in the woods. Coolidge saw the gun fall silent. He saw the wounded gunner bleeding in the leaves, and without hesitation, the cook picked up the weapon, dragged it into a small depression along the ridge, and began firing. It is difficult to truly appreciate what this moment meant. Coolidge was not assigned to fight. He had no formal training as a machine gunner. He had no reason, beyond duty, to expose himself. But he understood that the collapse of the machine gun position would unravel the entire company. So he set the tripod as best he could in the mud and braced his shoulders behind the weapon, just as the German assault intensified. The gun roared to life, cutting through branches and sending bursts of tracers across the ravine. German troops, stunned to find the machine gun suddenly back in operation, broke into cover. Coolidge's bursts pinned down multiple enemy squads and disrupted the initial German advance. For a moment, the American line held, and Coolidge's steady fire along the tree line became the anchor point of the entire defense. What none of the Americans initially realized, and what Coolidge discovered only through the sheer weight of the attacks, was that they were facing an enemy force roughly 6 times their size. German infantry poured forward in waves, supported by heavy weapons and coordinated movement. These were not inexperienced troops. They were veterans accustomed to fighting in difficult terrain. As more German assaults were launched, Coolidge continued firing. When the barrel overheated, he swapped it under fire. When his belt of ammunition ran low, he crawled through the underbrush to retrieve more from fallen comrades. The air filled with the thunder of rifles, machine guns, grenades, and German mortars thumping in the distance. The shallow ditch Coolidge occupied became a focal point of destruction. As the hours dragged on, German troops made repeated attempts to flank or rush the machine gun nest. Coolidge responded each time with calm, controlled bursts. Other American soldiers later recalled that Coolidge's tone never changed. He spoke quietly, gave simple instructions, and reassured panicked men, even as explosions ripped open tree trunks just yards away. His steadiness prevented collapse. His firepower repelled advances. His willingness to expose himself gave others courage to stay in position. What was intended to be a short engagement had now evolved into something far more serious. And as Coolidge's lone machine gun position continued to thwart German attempts to break through, the enemy escalated their efforts. Those efforts, and Coolidge's response to them, would define the next chapters of this extraordinary battle. As the Allied advance pushed steadily through France during the autumn of 1944, the German army, bleeding men, fuel, and equipment, had begun to fall back toward the protective barrier of the German frontier. The Vosges Mountains, a tangled stretch of dense pine forests, steep ridges, and narrow valleys, became a natural defensive shield behind which German forces regrouped. For the Americans of the 36th Infantry Division and its attached units, this terrain was unlike anything they had encountered during the summer breakout. Every slope was a potential ambush, every ridgeline a concealed firing position, and every village a fortified node in a larger defensive system. Small patrols became large engagements with little warning. Supply routes were constantly harassed by enemy fire, and communication lines were constantly threatened by German infiltration teams. It was in this unforgiving, claustrophobic environment that Technical Sergeant 5th Grade Charles Henry Coolidge, a soft-spoken Tennessee soldier serving as a company cook, found himself thrust from routine duty into one of the most extraordinary small unit stands of the European War. Coolidge had earned the respect of his unit long before the German attack. Although a cook by duty roster, he had repeatedly volunteered for frontline support, carrying ammunition, tending to wounded men, and acting as a steady presence for younger soldiers shaken by the intensity of the Vosges campaign. His manner was calm, almost disarmingly gentle. He rarely raised his voice, and his drawl carried the slow, deliberate phrasing of someone who spoke only when necessary. Men trusted him immediately. His steadiness under fire, his willingness to help anyone who needed it, and his reassuring refusal to panic made him an unofficial anchor in the company. Yet nothing in his demeanor hinted at the ferocity he would display when compelled to fight for his life and the lives of those around him. On the morning of October 24, 1944, Company M was moving through a wooded slope near the village of Bieselsberg, tasked with probing German lines and determining whether the terrain ahead held significant resistance. The area had been contested repeatedly for weeks. Both sides had exchanged ground several times, and intelligence on enemy positions was vague. Fog hung between the trees, muting sound and visibility. Patrol leaders expected scattered rifle fire or a small outpost, nothing more. But as the patrol approached a narrow clearing, the forest suddenly erupted with machine gun fire, mortars, and small arms bursts. Hidden German forces, later identified as elements of the 11th Panzer Division, including infantry and engineers, had set up a layered defensive trap. They had chosen their ground well. The Americans were channeled into an exposed segment of the slope, while the Germans were positioned higher, firing downhill from dug-in emplacements concealed by thick undergrowth. The first bursts cut down several American soldiers before they could find cover. Confusion rippled through the patrol as the sudden ambush overwhelmed the element of control. Coolidge, who had been moving near the front, immediately crawled toward a fallen machine gun team. One man was dead, the other wounded and unable to fire. Coolidge pulled the Browning .30 caliber machine gun from the dead gunner's hands, dragged the tripod toward a shallow depression in the ground, and set up his firing position under a rain of bullets. The Germans, believing they had caught a vulnerable American patrol in the open, surged forward to exploit the advantage. Coolidge's machine gun opened up, sending precise, disciplined bursts across the slope. His fire was not wild. Every burst was controlled, every belt change executed with calm efficiency. The Germans did not know a company cook was the one fueling this sudden defensive wall. They only knew the American fire was unexpectedly strong, breaking up their advance and preventing them from securing the clearing. What followed was not a quick skirmish, but the beginning of a grinding 36-hour ordeal. German forces attempted repeated assaults, shifting their angles of attack, adjusting their positions, and calling forward additional infantry. Coolidge's position became the central anchor for the American defense, because it lay at the one point on the slope from which the machine gun could command the main avenue of approach. Every attack was met with the same steady burst of fire. Soldiers lying beside him later recalled that he never raised his voice beyond a quiet command, never cursed, never muttered about being pinned down. He simply worked the machine gun, adjusted the sights, changed belts, and fired. Over time, the depression he occupied grew into a shallow trench carved out by bullets and shrapnel. At several points, the gun barrel overheated, glowing faintly in the cold air. Coolidge let it cool long enough to avoid a jam before resuming fire. When ammunition began to run low, he crawled forward under fire to retrieve belts from dead or wounded soldiers, dragging them back to his makeshift foxhole. Mortar fire bracketed the position repeatedly, sending earth and metal fragments into the air. Splinters tore his uniform, grazed his skin, and peppered the stock of the machine gun, but he remained at his post. Other soldiers rotated in and out, some wounded, others too exhausted to continue. But Coolidge held his position continuously. His determination became contagious. More Marines and infantrymen rallied to support the line, precisely because he held it without hesitation. The German officers coordinating the assault soon realized they were dealing with more than a stalled patrol. They brought forward additional infantry squads and machine gun teams, attempting to flank the position. Coolidge adjusted his fire accordingly, shifting the tripod, changing elevation, and issuing quiet, steady instructions. His fire broke up flanking movements and forced the Germans to fall back repeatedly. The attackers came within yards of his trench at several points, shouting, firing, and throwing grenades. Several grenades landed close enough to shower him with soil and fragments, yet he continued to fire until the enemy retreated again. As daylight faded and darkness settled in, the forest transformed into a maze of shadows and flickering muzzle flashes. Coolidge's machine gun continued to speak in short bursts, marking his position like a lighthouse in the chaos. Through the night and into the next morning, the pattern repeated. A German push, a sustained burst of American fire from Coolidge's position, and a retreat back up the slope. By dawn on the second day, the Americans had stabilized their perimeter, but the Germans launched one more coordinated assault, this time bringing forward armored vehicles. Coolidge's response was immediate. He raked the advancing vehicles with machine gun fire, targeting exposed infantry and the vulnerable aspects of the armored hulls. He reportedly disabled at least 2 vehicles with accurate fire, forcing the remaining armor to fall back. By the end of the 36-hour engagement, German forces began to withdraw from the immediate area, uncertain how many Americans they had faced and stunned that their calculated ambush had failed to break through. When reinforcements finally arrived and Coolidge relinquished his gun, he simply nodded, exhausted but steady, as though the previous day and a half had been nothing more than a routine shift. For the men whose lives he had saved, the sight of him standing quietly beside the machine gun was unforgettable. A cook who had become, for those desperate hours, the immovable center of their survival. As the fight near Beazlesburg intensified through the late morning, the German forces adjusted their strategy, shifting from probing attacks to more concentrated thrusts intended to collapse the American line through sheer numerical weight. The Germans understood that the shallow ridge occupied by Coolidge's men was the last meaningful barrier before the terrain fell sharply toward the rear of the 36th Infantry Regiment's defensive zone. If they broke through here, they could unhinge the American flank, roll downhill into the supply and command elements, and potentially turn a contained engagement into a divisional-level crisis. The importance of this ground, insignificant on a map, yet decisive in its placement, forced Coolidge into a position he never sought but refused to abandon. His men were scattered through tree lines and foxholes, improvised shelters and ditches, and the Germans used every fold of terrain to press closer. Mortar rounds bracketed the slope, machine gun bursts tore through the branches overhead, and small arms fire echoed in bursts as both sides tried to feel out weaknesses. Coolidge's machine gun position quickly became the axis of resistance. When the first German squad attempted to flank from the left using a wooded draw, he shifted the .30 caliber gun and laid down fire that cut across the foliage, sending the attackers scrambling back down the hillside. The gun overheated repeatedly, requiring him to swap barrels or pause momentarily. But each time he got it running again, the rhythm of controlled bursts resumed. His method of firing was deliberate rather than frantic, a steady pattern that kept the enemy pinned without wasting precious ammunition. German reports later indicated they believed multiple American machine gun crews were engaging them. In reality, it was the calm precision of a single cook with a single gun. His unit's riflemen, spread thin and relying on him to hold the center, were able to reposition or dig in more securely because his fire never wavered. When German reinforcements arrived, elements believed to belong to the 11th Panzer Division's infantry detachment, they brought heavier weaponry and greater organization. Grenadiers attempted a coordinated push supported by light mortars, hoping to storm the American position before a larger counteraction could be arranged by U.S. command. They advanced in bounding teams, moving from tree to tree, using ruined stone walls for cover, and probing with rifle grenades. Coolidge spotted them gathering near a thicket roughly 150 yards to his right and shifted his fire again. The team carrying the squad's light machine gun went down almost instantly. The rest of the formation hesitated, scattered, and momentarily dissolved into the trees, unsure how many American automatic weapons were targeting them. Throughout this period, the Germans attempted to communicate demands for surrender. Using English and amplified by the terrain, they shouted challenges up toward the ridge, urging the Americans to lay down their weapons. Coolidge responded exactly once, yelling back that if they wanted the Americans to surrender, they could come and get them. After that brief exchange, the Germans stopped trying to negotiate. They began preparing for a heavier assault, likely realizing the defenders were fewer in number than they originally assumed. With increasing waves of pressure, the ridge became a magnet for German infantry. Coolidge and the few men able to operate nearby weapons had to rotate tasks, drag ammunition belts through mud, and redistribute rifle clips among the scattered foxholes. Coolidge himself several times crawled into dangerous terrain to retrieve ammunition from fallen soldiers or abandoned packs. Each time, he exposed himself to fire in order to keep the machine gun active. The Germans noted his movements and attempted to kill him specifically, recognizing that silencing the gun would break the backbone of the defense. In mid-afternoon, the Germans made their most concentrated attempt to overrun the position. Using smoke grenades and covering fire, they approached to within grenade range from multiple angles. Coolidge, seeing figures pushing through drifting smoke, fired into the movement, sweeping the ground at waist height. Several attackers fell, but more kept coming. The Americans threw grenades back and forth in brief exchanges. One German soldier reached a point only yards away, throwing a grenade that landed barely short of Coolidge's ditch. He kicked it aside, buried himself momentarily against the ground as it detonated, and returned fire almost immediately. Riflemen to his left and right attempted to reinforce the gun, but the concentration of German pressure forced them to reposition or withdraw slightly, placing even more of the burden on him. The smoke cleared gradually, revealing German bodies scattered in the underbrush and others retreating to regroup farther downslope. The fighting dragged into evening with no letup. The dense woods magnified sound, making it difficult to distinguish between actual approach and the echoes of distant firefights. Coolidge's position had become a nerve center for the entire line. Runners carrying field notes or ammunition passed through his ditch, taking advantage of the relative safety created by the gunfire. Officers issued low-voiced instructions, warning that the enemy was massing again for a possible night assault. Coolidge barely slept. instead cleaning the weapon, repositioning ammunition, and keeping watch. The men around him depended on the stability he projected. He spoke plainly and calmly, keeping younger soldiers steady, even as the forest filled with shadows and scattered gunfire. The next morning brought renewed German pressure. Fresh infantry units, supported by engineers and at least one